What is up, guys? This video is about getting the most impact from the communications that you have, exerting the most influence, getting more success from the communications that you have. Ultimately, this is one of the original reasons why communication became so important to me. It's because I want to have a larger impact and I wanted to, put simply, get more of my way. I thought my way was the best way. But unfortunately, when you go out into the real world and have to deal with a bunch of people, they don't always see it the same way. So ultimately, you get into the realm of persuasion in convincing people to think more like you and to see things your way in order to get them to help you or get them to basically support your cause. A lot of times it's really just to get them to help you one way or the other. If you sum it up as simply as possible. Sometimes you have to help getting people out of the way. Sometimes you need people's resources. Sometimes it's as simple as having somebody understand you a little bit better and not violate your expectations or your boundaries. Just put simply, it's to get your way more often, which is beneficial for you, right? It doesn't have to be selfish necessarily. It can sound that way, but this is very one-sided. Ultimately, it could be about your cause, right? If it's in a relationship, your goal is to have a healthier relationship. Your boundaries are important. And so your expectations and your needs are also important. Communicating those things is incredibly important. To put this simply, or to connect some of these dots, some of the greatest influence that you'll need to exert is by changing people's beliefs. Using the relationship example for starters is looking at the belief that your partner may have that something is important. And what is important to you and how you see it should be important to them. If it's not, it'll never be effective. But that's simply the takeaway, is understanding the importance of a message that you want to communicate to an audience. An audience could be one person, it could be a group of people, it could be several groups of one. But ultimately, you're considering the needs, wants, and desires of the audience. This is the single simplest way and most fundamental way to increase the impact and influence of your communications. What you deem important is not necessarily important to anyone else. So that doesn't matter. What matters most is what they find important and how you can connect your message, your request, your need for help, or your wants, your desires, to what they find important. Relationship becomes a lot easier, right? Because what's important to you and the happiness and overall well-being of the relationship should be important to your partner. If it's not, probably isn't going to work out. We get into more complicated contexts with limited resources, varying priorities, such as an organizational one, then the challenge becomes more severe. Or if you get into a sales environment, right? What the customer wants versus what your product can give them, and whether or not you can align those two things. But at the end of the day, the biggest consideration that you need to have is not why something is important to you in conveying a message in that way. When I was in my early 20s, that was what I did all the time. And brute force might have got me so far, but ultimately I learned this lesson probably about 2 years into my career. And unfortunately, probably about 10 to 15 years after that, in my personal life, is determining what's important to the audience, to the person you're speaking to, or to the group you're speaking to. That's ultimately the simplest way to increase the impact of your message. Now, that is trickier than it sounds, right? Understanding the needs, the wants, and what your audience seems is important. This becomes the exercise in becoming a better communicator, is understanding the various audiences you will need to interact with throughout your life in all the different contexts, and understanding that truly being an effective communicator comes down to the relationships that you build over time. Without a relationship, without an understanding, it could be nearly impossible to be effective. You can use all of this information, however, to be more effective, right? If you do not have an established relationship, how do you create the basis of one? How do you do your homework? And how do you find out about another person and what's important to them? That's important. Important is a key element of this video, I suppose. It's becoming very redundant. Or in the establishing communications that you have with people over time, determining what's important to them. Leading several people, sometimes money's the most important thing, sometimes their job development, sometimes their career development, sometimes their personal development, sometimes their family. Each of these factors are the levers that you need to cater your messages around authentically and transparently, but those are the things that matter. And if what you need does not align with those things, you'll have a very difficult time getting what you want to happen out of a situation. There's a simple model that I learned a long time ago, which I struggle to always agree with, but I think fundamentally it's useful. It's beliefs drive behaviors, drive results, which just means what you think is what you do. What you think drives what you do, drives what you get. So if we use this model for other people, we're going to need to change what they think. And if you can connect your request to what they already find important, you don't have to change much. You're just connecting dots. That's the simplicity of this method. And making something that can be a very complicated element of communication very simple. It's just aligning them with what they already find to be important. So whether this be establishing boundaries, establishing expectations, establishing boundaries in a personal relationship, establishing expectations in a management situation or in a team situation, or I guess in a personal sense as well, consider what's most important to them, to the audience. It's a fundamental lesson of organizational communication. I learned then. It's a fundamental lesson that a friend of mine taught me back in the early days of my career. This has taken several years to sink in. I'm not necessarily a fast learner, but writing about this and writing and understanding that I think communication can be both transactional and transformational. Transactional communication is what we exhibit and what we see most of the time. It's the examples we see every day. I think those those messages and those communications are primarily due to the importance of the message. And the fact is that the audience gets to choose the importance, not the sender, not the deliverer of the message. You don't get to choose the importance, the audience does. And by aligning with what they find important, you can increase your impact and influence. It's a fundamental takeaway from this lesson. I'm writing on this to kind of see it from as many angles as I possibly can. But I also want to remember the days of not knowing this. And hopefully you find it helpful. But you could take that fundamental nugget that the audience determines what's important, and if your message aligns with that, you will have much greater impact. You will have much more success. So just remember, you can't lose if you don't quit.